Chronicon Mundi.
Dive deep into history.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're journeying into a history written not in military victories or, political treaties, but in seismic shifts and volcanic mudslides.
That's right.
We are diving deep into the story of Antigua, Guatemala, what many people just call La Antigua.
A truly stunning place.
It is. And it was once the imperial nerve center of Central America, but it was repeatedly defeated and finally, abandoned, and not by an invading army, but by the relentless forces of nature.
It's a profound study in resilience and, I guess, defeat, all wrapped into one perfect cobblestone package. What we're really analyzing here is the strategic history of the preeminent capital of the entire Captaincy General of Guatemala.
And that's a key point. This wasn't some minor outpost.
Not at all. This was the seat of power for a vast kingdom. I mean, it spanned modern-day Guatemala, Belize, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and even Chiapas in Mexico.
A huge territory.
Enormous.
Yeah.
And the central paradox of this whole deep dive is, trying to understand how such an important administrative structure, a city governing millions of square miles, was repeatedly just humbled by its own geography.
Geography as the true, unyielding protagonist in the story. So, okay, let's unpack this journey. Our mission today is to trace this viceroyal administration across 3 different locations.
3 foundations, yeah.
We'll chronicle the specific catastrophes that forced them to keep moving, detail the fascinating architectural adaptations they came up with, and ultimately explain why the imperial act of abandoning this great city is precisely what made it the UNESCO World Heritage Treasure it is today.
And we really need to focus on the human and political drama embedded in that cycle of destruction. We're not just going to be listing dates of earthquakes.
Right.
We're exploring this 200-year cycle of building, shaking, repairing, and then finally surrendering to the inevitable. And how that whole process created a totally unique cultural footprint.
Okay, so to truly appreciate the current location of Antigua, we have to start by realizing it was the Crown's 3rd attempt, their 3rd swing at establishing a stable capital.
The 3rd time's the charm, I guess.
Maybe. This region was supposed to be the administrative anchor for the entire kingdom, but it fought back right from the very start.
It absolutely did. I mean, the Spanish needed a paramount seat, a capital that could house the Captain General, the High Court, the Treasury, and they needed it to be stable, centrally located, and, of course, defensible.
The basic checklist for any capital city.
Exactly. But the history of the Captaincy General shows they just consistently overestimated their ability to achieve that stability. First against indigenous resistance, and then crucially against geological volatility.
So let's look at that very first attempt. This is back in 1524. Where did they choose to build, and why did it fail so quickly?
Okay, so the initial foundation was on the Day of St. James, which was Monday, July 25, 1524. They named it Ciudad de Santiago de los Caballeros de Guatemala.
The city of St. James of the Knights of Guatemala.
A very grand name. And the location they chose, well, it wasn't an empty field. It was the existing Cachical Maya city of Iximche.
Right. This was a pretty standard Spanish playbook, wasn't it? Building directly on top of pre-existing settlements to establish control. Did they really not see the immediate, sustained resistance coming from the Cachical?
It seems like it was a blend of, arrogance and strategic calculation. Iximche was a defensible site. It sat on a plateau. And taking control of an existing city was a powerful way to assert dominance over the conquered population.
Right.
But they gravely underestimated the resilience and the organization of the Cachical people. The uprisings were constant. Maintaining supply lines was a nightmare. And the site just proved to be militarily unsustainable.
So they were forced out.
They were. They had to abandon that location pretty quickly, moving within just 3 years. So you could say political stability was the first casualty of this whole project.
So they try again. This leads to the second foundation, starting in 1527. They seem to have learned their lesson about military vulnerability, but it looks like they just swapped one massive risk for another.
They certainly did. They relocated on November 22, 1527, moving about 25 miles south. They chose the Valley of Almalonga.
And Almalonga translates to what?
It translates perfectly as place of water. They kept the capital's name, Santiago de los Caballeros, and settled near what is now the little village of San Miguel Escobar. This spot was chosen for, better access and defense.
A place of water. That feels like some serious foreshadowing.
It really does, because this time it was geology that ended the experiment. Specifically, a terrifying hydrological event in 1541.
September 11th, 1541, what happened?
The settlement was, and I mean this literally, utterly wiped out. It wasn't an earthquake, though an earthquake might have triggered it. It was a devastating lahar.
A lahar. For anyone who might not be familiar, what exactly is that?
A lahar is a really violent type of mudflow or landslide. It's composed of volcanic ash, rock debris, and water. In this case, just massive amounts of debris and water roared down the slopes of the nearby volcano and just buried the town.
And the scale of this catastrophe was so immense, it actually renamed the mountain itself.
Exactly. The sheer destructive power of this water event was so great, so memorable, that the volcano looming above it was permanently christened Volcán de Agua.
The volcano of water.
The volcano of water. It stands there today as this terrifying, beautiful, natural monument to that very disaster.
And the sources give us this incredibly dramatic anecdote about the human cost here, specifically the story of Beatriz de la Cueva.
Oh, it's a story that sounds like it was ripped from a novel. Beatriz was the wife of the famous conquistador, Pedro de Alvarado.
Right.
When Alvarado died shortly before this lahar, Beatriz skillfully leveraged her connections and, frankly, her political acumen to succeed him as governor.
And in doing so, she became the first female ruler in the New World. That's a huge historical first.
A huge first. But her reign lasted just 2 days.
2 days.
The 1541 lahar swept right through her palace. She and many others fled to the rooftop chapel, thinking it was the safest place, only for the entire roof to collapse, killing her.
Wow.
And what's so fascinating and, deeply cynical is that her political enemies immediately weaponized the disaster. They interpreted her rapid, violent death as divine punishment for a woman daring to hold such high temporal power.
So it solidified this image of the city as being somehow cursed, either by God or just by nature itself.
Precisely.
So, okay, they've been displaced first by resistance and second by a catastrophic flood. The imperial authorities now have to make a fundamental geological calculation for their third foundation. This brings us to the Panchoy Valley.
The current location of Antigua, yes.
And this move in 1543 was the strategic shift of this entire history, wasn't it?
It really was. They moved about 8 kilometers or 5 miles away and refounded the city on March 10th, 1543. They had definitively learned that the risk of a catastrophic lahar and flooding at Almalonga was just too high to repeat.
So their solution was to accept the known chronic risk of seismic activity. I mean, they're building a major capital right on the Ring of Fire because they felt they had successfully mitigated the specific risk of a lahar.
That's it. It was a conscious trade-off. It was a calculated risk that reflects the constraints of the entire region. There simply wasn't a perfect, seismically dead zone that was also fertile and strategically located.
They had to choose their poison, so to speak.
In a way, yes. They chose the best valley they could find, the Panchoy Valley, knowing full well that tremors would be a constant menace. But they trusted that architecture and elevation could defeat earthquakes better than they could defeat a lahar.
And for a while, that bet paid off.
For over 2 centuries, that calculation worked. Santiago de los Caballeros became the most stable, most important seat of governance in all of Central America.
Okay, so once they're established in the Panchoy Valley, Santiago de los Caballeros truly flourishes. And again, this wasn't just a town, this was the beating heart of the entire Captaincy General.
Absolutely. It functioned as the political, cultural, and economic nucleus for a territory that, as we said, was roughly the size of Texas and France combined.
That sense of geopolitical gravity is key. Let's elaborate on the kind of infrastructure you need to run an entire kingdom from this one spot in the mountains.
Well, the concentration of power was enormous. Of course, it housed the Captain General, who was the supreme administrative and military officer, but the real heavyweight institution was the Real Audiencia of Santiago de Guatemala.
The High Appellate Court. Tell us a bit more about its significance.
Well, it was sometimes called the Audiencia of los Confines, the Court of the Boundaries.
The boundaries.
Yeah, because it was responsible for resolving border and jurisdictional disputes across this vast kingdom, which was situated right at the boundary between the Viceroyalty of New Spain to the north and the Viceroyalty of Peru to the south.
So it was the ultimate legal arbiter for a huge, contentious area.
Yeah. Exactly. Having that ultimate judicial authority centered here meant that disputes from Nicaragua, from El Salvador, even from parts of southern Mexico, they all had to be settled in Santiago. Its physical presence elevated the capital far beyond just a mere administrative center.
And the city's dine, its urban sophistication, it was meant to reflect that power. It rivaled cities in Europe.
Precisely. The Spanish didn't just throw up buildings randomly. They implemented what's called the traza system of town planning.
Okay.
It's a rigid geometric grid pattern inspired by the Italian Renaissance ideals of order and control. The streets ran true north-south and east-west, and they all culminated in the Parque Central, the Plaza Mayor, which was, of course, ringed by the most important buildings: the cathedral, the Captain General's palace, the city hall. It was a masterclass in hierarchical urban design.
And beyond just being the administrative hub, the city became a major commercial and artistic powerhouse, all while under this constant threat of disaster.
It did. Economically, it was a hub for some really high-value agricultural exports. Things like cacao, indigo for blue dyes, and particularly cochineal dye.
That's the one that produces that really rich crimson color, right?
It's the one, highly prized. But culturally, Santiago was famous throughout the Americas and even back in Spain as a major exporter of religious images and statues. The craftsmanship here was considered world-class, and it created a distinct visual identity that was then shipped all across the Spanish Empire.
But this entire architectural marvel, this whole cultural project, was fundamentally constrained by that geological choice they made back in 1543. They accepted the earthquakes, and in doing so, they had to invent a whole new style of architecture.
That's the brilliance of the Baroque Antiguo, the Antiguan Baroque. And this wasn't, stylistic vanity. It was functional anti-seismic engineering that evolved over 2 centuries of trial and error, a lot of error.
So what specifically defines this unique style? Beyond just looking beautiful, what were they doing differently?
The principles focused relentlessly on mass and stability. So firstly, they used extremely massive, thick walls, we're talking sometimes 2 or 3 feet deep, which provided critical lateral stability.
So when the earth shakes from side to side.
Right. The buildings are subjected to these horizontal forces.
Mm-hmm.
By increasing the sheer mass and thickness of the walls, they could absorb more of that kinetic energy and resist being displaced.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, they drastically minimized height. Almost all major construction was restricted to single-story edifices to reduce the structural leverage and torsion during a tremor.
Even the really grand features of church architecture, the things that define a European cathedral, had to be changed.
Absolutely. Think about traditional European cathedrals. They have these massive soaring bell towers designed to signal the presence of God and the church from miles away.
Right, they're landmarks.
In Santiago, those are collapse hazards. So the Baroque Antiguo style mandated low bell towers, often squat, and integrated directly into the facade. This ensured that if they did fall, they wouldn't bring down the main structure of the church or collapse out into the street.
And the ornamentation.
Even that was different. The decorative elements were usually executed in lightweight stucco rather than heavy carved stone. This made the decoration less likely to, fall off and cause injury.
And we know this adaptation was absolutely essential because the tremors were just nonstop, just in the 16th century alone.
The evidence speaks for itself. We have records of 6 major earthquakes before the year 1600. There was one in 1530, the 1541 Lahar event, which may have been triggered by a quake, and then major quakes in 1565, 1575, 1578, and 1585.
Wow.
Architects were literally in a constant state of iteration. They were fixing the damage from one quake only to design the next structure to try and withstand the next predicted tremor.
This constant rebuilding effort actually brings us to another part of the city's life, the intellectual life, particularly the fight to establish a university.
Yes, the Royal and Pontifical University of San Carlos Borromeo. This is a really fascinating political subplot.
The intellectual foundations were laid early, right?
Very early. The first bishop of Guatemala, a man named Francisco Marroquin, requested a university way back in 1548. He even left money in his will in 1562 to establish a school. But the official university, the Royal and Pontifical one, was delayed for over a century.
Why so much resistance, especially when the city was already such an established elite center? You'd think they'd want a university.
It came largely from internal institutional politics. The established religious orders, particularly the Jesuits, who ran the very prestigious school of San Lucas, they fiercely resisted the creation of a public university.
Why? Competition.
Exactly. They feared losing their near monopoly on educating the children of the wealthy Creole nobility. The university finally received its royal decree in 1676, and classes began in 1681.
And what did they teach?
Law, theology, medicine. This institution became the crucible for the intelligentsia of all of Central America, which further cemented Santiago's indispensability and, crucially, the Creole elite's local power.
Speaking of elite history, the city also served as the final resting place for one of the most famous chroniclers of New World.
That's right, the remains of Bernal Diaz del Castillo. He was a key figure in the conquest alongside Cortés and wrote the indispensable true history of the conquest of New Spain. His remains were interred here.
And his tomb, like so many others,
eventually succumbed to the quakes. His physical presence and the fact that his tomb was destroyed, it just reinforces how deeply the city held the physical history of the viceroyal era, even as that history was constantly being reduced to rubble.
So for over 200 years, these architectural adaptations worked, more or less. They allowed the city to recover from shock after shock. But by the early 18th century, the earth began delivering blows that were just too powerful to absorb. And we start with the 1717 San Miguel earthquake.
This was the warning shot. This was the moment the crown first seriously considered surrender.
When was it?
September 29th, 1717. It was a massive event, estimated at a moment magnitude of 7.4 milliwaters, hitting a violent intensity of IX on the Mercalli scale.
So what was the physical damage like, and why was this quake so different from all the others they had endured for centuries?
The scale of the damage was just unprecedented. Over 3,000 buildings were ruined. This included the destruction of many of the great temples and the royal palace itself. This wasn't a minor repair job. This was a fundamental structural catastrophe that demanded a total reassessment of the city's viability as a capital.
And for the first time, they officially talked about moving.
For the first time, yes. Authorities formally debated moving the capital.
But the move didn't actually happen for another 56 years. That's a long time for a political decision to be delayed after such a clear warning. What fueled that inertia?
Powerful vested interests. The Creole elites, the local landowners and merchants whose wealth and status were tied irrevocably to Santiago, and the powerful religious orders, they strongly opposed the move.
So they fought back.
They did. They argued that the sheer financial and cultural investment, the entire institutional infrastructure they had built over 2 centuries, was simply too immense to just abandon, and they won the political battle. They argued for repair and restoration.
So millions were poured back into rebuilding this incredibly vulnerable capital.
Yes. An architect named Diego de Porres spearheaded the repairs. The royal palace, for example, underwent major restoration, which was a symbol of the city's stubborn commitment to its location. This political victory for the local elites just meant that the inevitable was merely postponed.
It really highlights the tension between local power and the central imperial administration.
Absolutely. And it brings us to the terminal event. The Santa Marta earthquakes of 1773. This is when the Earth finally definitively won the argument.
Tell us about it.
Well, the sequence of tremors actually began in May of 1773, but the main shock hit on July 29, which is the feast day of St. Martha. That's why they bear her name. The magnitude was around 7.5 miles, delivering at a severe intensity of 7th to 8th. This quake was the structural and administrative death blow for the city.
If the Baroque Antigua architecture was so advanced, so specifically designed for this, why was the collapse so complete in 1773 that the administration failed completely? Does that suggest that the architecture was, in the end, a failure?
That's a crucial question. The architecture did help, but there's a limit to what even the thickest walls can endure. More importantly, many of the structures that failed had been significantly weakened by the 1717 quake and all the subsequent smaller tremors. They were buildings on borrowed time.
But you're saying the failure wasn't purely structural?
No, it was systemic.
Let's focus on that distinction, the humanitarian failure versus the physical destruction.
The immediate fatality count was tragic. It's estimated at 500 to 600 people who were directly crushed by collapsing buildings. But the real indictment of the site's vulnerability was the complete failure of the government to manage the aftermath.
So what happened after the shaking stopped?
The sources confirmed that at least another 600 people died from starvation and disease in the following weeks and months. This demonstrated that Santiago, while it was geographically central, was infrastructurally incapable of sustaining itself as a capital during a prolonged crisis. Its dependence on imported resources and its lack of any robust emergency capacity it doomed it.
In the immediate chaos of the ruins, with such complete physical destruction, how did the community even find the capacity to organize and, reestablish their daily rituals?
It's fascinating how quickly they turned to faith for solace and for structure. Scholars documented that in the immediate aftermath, people were literally singing in the streets, mixing the sounds of moaning and wailing with church chants and hymns. It was a form of mass public repentance, viewing the disaster as a clear sign of divine displeasure.
So religious ritual was paramount, even if the grand buildings were all gone.
Absolutely. Within just 2 weeks, priests were holding Mass, people were terrified of the few roofs that were still standing, so services were conducted in temporary straw ranches that were erected in the open plazas.
And music was important here.
Music became critical. It wasn't just decoration. It was necessary to imbue these provisional, often undignified spaces with the solemnity and spiritual weight that the stone churches once provided.
And this financial collapse caused by the quake, it even trickled down and fundamentally altered the artistic output of the capital's composers.
Yes, that's a perfect example of the ripple effects. The disaster severely constrained the viceroyal treasury. The church, which was the main patron of the arts, became extremely conservative with its funds. They couldn't afford to commission new scores from major European centers like Madrid or Rome.
So what did the composers do?
They had to resort to frugality. The cathedral's Kapellmeister, its music director, had to recycle, rearrange, and adapt existing pieces. They'd often use older villancicos, a type of religious carol, or even draw on student compositions to meet the consistent ritualistic demand for new music for celebrations like Corpus Christi.
So geology was directly impacting Baroque musical composition in Central America.
Perfect example, yes.
So the 1773 disaster creates this political vacuum, and the King of Spain, Charles III, he seizes the moment. The decision not to rebuild was finalized, and this time it overrode all previous local resistance.
It did, and the source was very clear. This wasn't just about seismic safety. It was tied up in the broader political movement that was sweeping the Spanish Empire at the time.
What was that?
This happened during the height of the Bourbon reforms. Charles III was focused on strengthening and centralizing absolute imperial power. And the entrenched Creole elites and the religious orders in Santiago, the same ones who resisted the move after 1717, they represented decentralized power and vested local interests.
So moving the capital was actually a political opportunity disguised as disaster relief.
Precisely. The king and his captain general, a man named Martin de Mayorga, they viewed the earthquake as a gift. It provided the moral and political justification they needed to neutralize the established power base in Santiago. By moving the capital to a fresh site, the Valle de la Ermita, they could build a new administration, one free from the economic and political entanglements of the old city.
It was political surgery.
That's a great way of putting it.
The population who had lived there for centuries, they must have been incredibly reluctant to leave everything behind. How did the crown enforce this move?
The reluctance was massive. People were tied to their homes, their land, their businesses. The crown had to be coercive. A royal decree was issued on July 21st, 1775, authorizing the relocation to the new site, which was christened Nueva Guatemala de la Asunción.
Today's Guatemala City.
That's right. And the coercive measures they used were targeted directly at the two things that sustained civil life, which commerce and religion. They issued strict prohibitions against all business activity in the old city, functionally destroying the local economy overnight. And simultaneously, they prohibited all major religious processions and rituals.
So they outlawed both the market and the mass.
Exactly. By doing that, they removed the two fundamental reasons for anyone to remain in Santiago. They systematically eliminated both civil and spiritual life.
And the new capital literally rose from the bones of the old one.
It did. The transfer involved a systematic salvage operation. Balconies, pillars, doors, ironwork, religious art. It was all stripped from the ruins of the old city and carted the 30 miles to the Valle de la Ermita to be incorporated into the construction of New Guatemala. The old city was officially ordered abandoned and was referred to from then on simply as La Antigua Guatemala.
The old Guatemala. And what happened to the population?
Santiago had peaked at around 65,000 residents in the 1770s. The majority were forced to relocate. The demographic collapse was swift and severe. The city was left derelict, essentially just a small regional center for farming, until inhabitants began to slowly trickle back in the mid-19th century, spurred largely by agricultural interests.
And here we have this magnificent paradox of this whole history. The imperial crown failed to keep the capital stable and then ordered its destruction by abandonment. But that very failure is what created the city's modern status as a preserved treasure.
This is the surprising truth that defines Antigua. The imperial decree to abandon the city and not rebuild created a state of deliberate stagnation. No one was allowed to tear down the ruins or modernize the city structure. This enforced neglect, which lasted for over a century, froze the city's 16th century Renaissance grid pattern and preserved the monumental ruins exactly as the earthquakes had left them.
The crown wanted a clean break, but they inadvertently preserved a time capsule.
Perfectly put. And we have this fascinating glimpse of what that abandonment looked like in the early 20th century from a visit by Prince Wilhelm of Sweden.
What did he find?
His report from 1920 is incredibly evocative. He described a city that was still largely dilapidated. It had actually suffered further damage from the 1917-1918 earthquakes that took down some of the structures that had even survived 1773.
Wow.
He spoke of huge layers of dust in the streets, making people ill. He noted scenes that really underscore the abandonment. A native family had taken up quarters with their domestic animals inside the ruins of the Church of Grace. And he saw a mule grazing within the shattered dome of the Santa Clara convent. It was a place where nature and local life had completely reclaimed the imperial grandeur.
Moving into the modern era, Antigua's unique preserved state was finally recognized globally. It was made a national monument in 1944, and then in 1979, it secured its designation as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And this move really cemented the city's identity as a living museum.
That UNESCO status is a critical protective shield. It ensures that the characteristic Spanish Baroque-influenced architecture and that perfect original 16th century grid layout are protected from modern development. The ruins are not just piles of stone. They are monuments illustrating the destructive power of nature and the ingenuity of human builders.
Let's talk about some of these physical time capsules that visitors can experience today, starting with maybe the most famous visual symbol of the city.
That would have to be the iconic Arch of Santa Catalina. It was completed way back in 1693 as a covered walkway, a skyway, if you will.
A skyway for what?
It connected the cloistered nuns of the Santa Catalina Monastery with the school across the street, allowing them to pass unseen, in accordance with their vows of seclusion. It stood tall through the major quakes, though the recognizable little clock tower on top was a much later addition, installed in 1895.
And it's the perfect architectural element framed by the looming presence of Volcán de Agua. It's the picture everyone takes.
It is. But if you truly want to witness the specific destructive force of the 1773 quake, you have to go to La Recollection.
That's fair.
The ruins of La Recollection are essential viewing. They were intentionally left exactly as they lay after the 1773 Santa Marta event. The massive, enormous blocks of plaster, brick, and stone, the shattered domes, it is breathtaking. The authorities consciously decided to preserve this structure in a state of ruin, making it a definitive testament to the power of the quake.
I heard it was even used as a movie set.
It was. It's a place that speaks so powerfully to disaster that it was used as a filming location for the earthquake sequences in the 1982 Jack Nicholson film, The Border.
Huh. Now, the Cathedral of Santiago Parish of San Jose, that tells a story of compromise, doesn't it? The part they simply had to save.
That's right. What stands today is a working church, but it uses only the first two bays of the original massive structure. That original 16th century design was planned to be a truly enormous five-aisled building, a scale influenced by the great Cathedral of Seville, which itself drew on Moorish architecture.
So the working church today is just a small piece of the original ambition.
A very small piece. The rest of it remains preserved as these monumental ruins right behind the active altar. You can walk through them.
And another major religious center that survived through sheer willpower and modern restoration is the Church of San Francisco El Grande.
This complex is tremendously significant, primarily because it holds the remains of Saint Hermano Pedro de San Jose Betancourt. He was the first missionary saint of Central America. He was instrumental in establishing shelters for the poor and the Order of the Brothers of Our Lady of Bethlehem back in the mid-17th century.
And the church survived.
The Franciscans successfully recovered and rebuilt the church over the years, notably securing it after the major 1976 earthquake, and it remains a vital pilgrimage destination today.
Okay, let's shift to a cultural tidbit that ties directly back to all this disaster. The local nickname for the residents of Antigua, the Antigueños, they're called Panzas Verdes.
Panzas Verdes, literally green bellies. There are always competing origin stories for nicknames like this, but the most plausible and evocative one relates directly back to the aftermath of the 1773 Santa Marta earthquakes.
How so?
Because the food supply was completely cut off, survivors may have resorted to eating a near-exclusive diet of local herbs, herbas, and avocados, aguacates. This sustained diet of green food could have literally stained the clothes of the poor grain, or maybe it just generated a plausible myth about their stained stomachs. Either way, it's a nickname rooted in disaster and resilience.
And beyond the nickname, the deep spiritual traditions that were forged in the viceroyal era, they still thrive in the modern city, most spectacularly during Holy Week.
A Holy Week, or Semana Santa, is world famous. It is an elaborate, highly ritualized religious celebration. It features massive processions where enormous platforms carrying religious images of the Passion of Christ are carried through the streets by hundreds of people. But the true artistic marvel is the temporary street decoration.
The alfombras.
The alfombras, or carpets. These are intricate, temporary artistic masterpieces made of vibrantly dyed sawdust, flowers, pine needles, fruits, and vegetables. They are constructed in painstaking detail along the entire route of the procession.
Only to be destroyed moments later.
Exactly. They're destroyed by the passing of the platform. It's a breathtaking, ephemeral, artistic undertaking that renews the spiritual connection to the city's ancient roots every single year.
In the 21st century, Antigua has really pivoted its economy entirely, from imperial capital to a knowledge and heritage economy.
Right. Tourism is the economic mainstay, leveraging that spectacular preserved architecture and, of course, the stunning volcanic backdrop, which includes the perpetually active Volcán de Fuego.
And coffee.
And coffee. The surrounding region, and a cafe, is known for producing some of the world's highest quality coffee, which benefits from that rich volcanic soil. But one of the fastest growing primary industries is something else entirely. It's language immersion.
Right. Antigua is globally recognized for Spanish language studies.
It draws students from all over the world. The combination of its safety, its beauty, its rich historical context, and its proximity to the main international airport makes it an ideal place for full immersion Spanish language institutes. It's transformed the former administrative capital into a major hub for global education.
So, for anyone listening who is captivated by this juxtaposition of modern life against viceroyal ruins, the city is surprisingly accessible to visit.
It is remarkably convenient. Antigua is located just 30 miles west of Guatemala City. That's a manageable 45 to 60-minute drive from La Aurora Airport. And crucially, because it was built on that 16th century grid that was frozen in time by decree, the central city is extremely compact and pedestrian-friendly.
You can just walk it.
You can easily walk the cobblestone streets, tracing the footprint of the real Audiencia, standing under the shadow of the Arch of Santa Catalina, and experiencing that immediate, tangible connection between the destructive forces of the volcanoes and the preserved history of the empire.
What an incredible journey we've taken. From that first failed foundation at Iximche, through the devastating lahar that forced the move to the Panchoy Valley, witnessing 2 centuries of architectural ingenuity, and then finally reaching the moment the earth demanded the entire viceroyal apparatus move.
The story of Antigua, Guatemala is unique because it's a history of geography winning the fight against imperial authority. The chronic threat of natural forces, culminating in that complete humanitarian structural failure of 1773, mandated the relocation of the entire kingdom's administrative center.
It is a profound living museum, and it's perfectly preserved in a state of suspended animation entirely because of an imperial decree of abandonment. It stands today as a testament to the fact that while empire is fleeting, geological reality is absolute.
If you ever find yourself in Central America, it is a definitive invitation to walk through history, one cobblestone at a time.
And this leaves us with a provocative final thought, one that only the history of Antigua can really offer. The viceroyal crown ordered the city's complete abandonment, convinced the location was too volatile and unstable to sustain a capital, yet the modern city is a globally recognized, indispensable historical treasure precisely because of that definitive act of surrender.
So you have to ask yourself, is the greatest expression of resilience and conservation sometimes found not in stubborn rebuilding, but in the political wisdom of allowing the past to remain untouched?